So thank you all for the opportunity to talk with you today. I want to begin by acknowledging that the provocations I'm going to share, they're spoken by me, but they've been shaped and challenged by a number of colleagues and friends, students, authors, poets, and also the tides, the shore of the place in which I live on the east coast of Scotland. So all of these relationships have been absolutely core to my thinking. So I just can't claim all these thoughts as purely my own, although I'm not convinced the tide's lain awake half as much as I have pondering about this provocation piece, but maybe it has. And the reason why I've been worrying about this provocation piece or not felt comfortable is because of the word provocation, to provoke. And when I looked it up in the dictionary, there's a lot of reference to causing annoyance, to irritating. But in my search, I also found a definition within the US dictionary that said to call forth a feeling, an action, and to stir up purposely. So that felt a lot more comfortable to me, and that is the spirit in which I'm offering this piece, and I absolutely hope it's received in that way as well. And I'm also going to use the term educators for the most part throughout, because I firmly believe that every act is educational in some form. So the questions and the provocations I'll pose are first and foremost questions to ask of ourselves about our positionality, about how we act, about who we are, about what we value as teachers and learners, but fundamentally as planetary citizens. So I'm asking them of myself as well as I go through. And the title, I've chosen the title Learning for Unsustainability. And this could be understood in a number of ways. And first, yes, it's a play on learning for sustainability, the policy, the professional context that I and many of you have been engaged in since it became part of Scottish education in 2013. But I don't want this to be a policy piece. We might all be familiar with learning for sustainability policy, well, at least in principle, that it's an entitlement for learners, that it's a whole setting approach to life and to learning, and that every practitioner has a responsibility to weave this across their practice. And it's core to the GTCS, to the professional standards. And in recent years, it's been strengthened. In fact, the refreshed Learning for Sustainability Action Plan is perhaps it's been updated now. It's currently going through an update at the moment, and it's due out very soon, if not available at the moment. So I don't want to go down that policy route, but what I do want to say is that I absolutely keep a critical eye on the ways in which policy is working and not working, and how it translates into our daily professional practice as well. So it brings me to the issues that I do want to explore today, which are really to ask what it means to be a teacher in Scotland today, to look around and see that we are in times of uncertainty. We are amidst planetary and social fracture. I'm thinking, how do we respond professionally when we're facing issues of inequity, of poverty, of hunger, the climate crisis, this emergency, mass consumerism, loss of species, loss of biodiversity, and so on. And before I think about how we might take action, I want to pause and think about, well, what led us to this point? What led us here? And what is the role of education in carving a way forward from here as well? So the initial thoughts I had to think that this provoked in me were to think, well, what was the Learning for Sustainability? Why was that policy created? Why was that felt to be needed in the first place? And then I thought, well, I want to examine what is our ethical stance, our individual ethical stance, and really consider what becomes of us all and our planet if we don't take issues of sustainability seriously. And then what becomes of us if we feel that we are reduced to a tick box exercise, that we might find that we only have time to kind of fly the flag for sustainability without the space that we need to be able to question the very structures, the systems, the conditions that maintain and perpetuate these dangerous times, and to ask, are we then complicit in learning for unsustainability? Now, these are the issues that I want to explore a bit further. They're deep and they're real concerns of mine, and they genuinely do keep me awake at night. And to try and stick to the task that GTCS set me in terms of trying to come up with a provocation statement, I've tried to create an overarching provocation, and this is it here, and it's to say, given the enduring complex global challenges, that's the ecological, the social, the political, economic, that we are all internationally, nationally and locally facing in various ways, shapes, forms and intensities, do educators have an ethical obligation to orient education to acknowledge and act upon these issues as a core priority of the highest order. Now that's broad, that's rangy, I absolutely accept that. I don't think planetary and social societal collapse and education's role in that is going to fit neatly into a single slide, never mind get it down to a catchy kind of soundabout. But I think the point in itself is important, as this is a complex task, not least because of its interdisciplinary nature, the way in which it's connecting across all of these levels, international, national and local, but also the issues that it connects across as well. So the clear point here is this foregrounding of ethics, that the provocation is intentionally calling us to think about our own positionality in all of this. But before I push a bit further and kind of reduce that down into questions, some smaller questions, what I want to do is foreground a few things and set the scene a bit more. So I want to say a bit more about those sort of the complex, those interlinked, the ecological, social, economic issues, and share a framework for thinking about them. Now, the framework I want to share with you is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So these are 17 interlinked objectives, and the UN describes them as a call for action by all countries about promoting prosperity whilst protecting the planet. They recognise that ending poverty must go hand in hand with strategies that build economic growth and address a range of social needs, including education, health, social protection, job opportunities, whilst also tackling climate change and environmental protection. Now, I've got an issue with the SDGs, especially around that growth ideology. And the SDGs are contested. There is no getting away from that. But what I think is that they are helpful here to convey the relationships between the issues that we face. And the model that I prefer to use is this one here, because I believe it shows that complexity and the interconnectedness of the 17 goals better than the other model that I showed first of all. So what it does here, why I'm attracted to it, is that it shows that we're supported by the biosphere, life on land, life below water, and that society links to that. So we see the next layer of goals related to education, to peace, to sustainable cities, health and well-being, and so on. Then upon that, layered upon that, are issues of industry and infrastructure, responsible consumption, and so on. So on one level, I think it's absolutely useful to think of the global coherence, but we've got to hold that in relationship with the ways in which these issues are understood within nations and, importantly, within our local communities. So when I'm looking at this as a model, I'm thinking, okay, how are we encountering poverty, biodiversity loss, conflict, racism, health inequalities, spatial injustices, accessibility to clean water and healthcare within the places in which we live? So how are the young people who we are teaching and learning with, how are they experiencing these issues in their daily life? So I'm always trying to zoom out to think of the global picture, but more often than not, I'm zooming in to see what exists in the warp, in the weft, the fabric of the communities in which I live and work, the world in which we encounter on a daily basis. Bottom line is, I think we have to take a holistic approach, a broad approach, a systems thinking approach here, and see sustainability in the round and absolutely ground ourselves in terms of the world that we encounter and the world that our learners will and do encounter. I think that's crucial, that we need to hold those relationships in our minds. And when I think in that way, that leads me to think about how we create spaces for these encounters with the world within our educational spaces. At the moment, I'm maybe less concerned with the actual practice of doing that and more about how are we framing these experiences? How is our understanding as educators framing young people's experiences of them as well? So along with feeling uncomfortable with the term provocation, that I talked about at the outset, I also feel uncomfortable with another term, which is real world. And I use that term, and I've used it in relation to outdoor learning. So I talk about getting out of the classroom and into the real world. Nowadays, more often than not, I'm trying to be intentional about the use of the term living world rather than real world. And recently I heard the author Richard Powers. He was talking about these terms, real world and living world, in relation to Overstory, which is one of his fictional novels. And he talked about the real world as something that we can take to mean the human, the socially constructed world, but the living world is something that's more encompassing, something that actually forces humans to recognise that they are living within something alive, with agency, and occupied by hugely specific creatures whose desires are different from our own. And he talks about this in terms of the moment that we realise that we are not entitled to a place in this world and that we can't take that privilege for granted. And he talks about that as a great awakening, a great reckoning, but it's really the point that we realise the degree to which our existence has always been contingent on the air, the water and the soil that these other creatures are maintaining and creating. Now, to me, that way of thinking absolutely reflects that tiered model that I showed earlier of the SDGs that clearly showed life on water, life on land, the biosphere sustaining and supporting all of us, human and more than human beings. So if I think about the fact that due to the twin emergencies of biodiversity loss and the climate crisis, then I think we need to challenge this view of our human exceptionalism. I believe it's our belief that we can control and dominate all other aspects of the living world that's led us into these twin emergencies and more. I think we're now in a position of such deep uncertainty about our future that we need to find ways to become comfortable with the recognition that we are in fact part of the systems that require us to live within limits of growth and consumption. So there are some fundamental paradigmatic shifts that need to happen whereby we really need to step aside and take our place within the living world. Now, to help me visualise that shift, I find this image is really useful, and you might be familiar with it. To me, it captures the idea of a move from an egocentric way of thinking to a more ecocentric way of thinking. And what I feel is important here is it's not just a process of taking our place as part of rather than apart from the living world. It's also about shifting our ways of thinking to be in a more reciprocal relationship. So about developing a relationship of love and humility to all entities in the environment. It's about learning with and from the living world. So to come back to the provocation statement and the role of education specifically, there are a few other things I'd like us to hold in our minds when we start to think about that statement. And one of these is about the use of the word acting, to act upon these issues. I wholeheartedly believe that acting, the act of doing something to take some form of resistance or intentional move towards a way of thinking, being and doing in this world is powerful. My view is that our work as educators means that we have the opportunity, the ethical responsibility, the moral imperative to really consider how we choose to act, from what we choose to include or exclude from our practice, the places and the landscapes that we choose to teach within and learn from, the issues we feel we want to explore and discuss within our classrooms, the knowledges and forms of knowledges that we choose to engage with and to privilege. These actions and more, they all are making statements in some form that our learners and our colleagues may be and should be aware of. And I find these words from Apple back in 1993 really powerful, really important. They were talking about the politics of knowledge, and I think this is exciting and it's frightening in equal measure, but what it does is really reaffirm the power and the responsibility that we have as educators. They say the curriculum is never simply a neutral assemblage of knowledge. somehow appearing in the texts in the classrooms of a nation. It is always part of a selective tradition, someone's selection, some group's vision of legitimate knowledge. It's produced out of the cultural, political and economic conflicts, tensions and compromises that organise and disorganise a people. So as a teacher in Scotland today, I think we need to think about how our actions are enabling learners to respond, to thrive and to flourish within this living world. What is it that we value? These issues, to my mind, are at the heart of a continual sense checking that we should all be involved in, really asking ourselves if we're engaged in learning for sustainability or unconsciously engaged in learning for unsustainability. Now, I want to turn to the term learning for unsustainability, and I want to draw attention to the work of Vanessa Andreotti here. I really admire her work. I come back to it often. It always challenges my own ways of thinking. She is a fantastic agitator in that sense. Her work, and there's other work as well from colleagues such as Ariane Valls, who I'll come to later, that really are calling into question our position as educators, as often unintentionally being complicit in upholding practices and norms and cultures of unsustainability. Now, Andreotti's work gets directly to the heart of this. Back in 2021, she was asking questions about ethics, which really captured me. She is squarely holding a mirror up to all of us that are involved in education. And I'm just going to read them aloud here. So the questions are: what would be ethical to do if we accept that formal education is supporting an economic system that is undermining the conditions of possibility for the biophysical survival of human and other species? Is it ethical to assume and to foster hope in the continuity of the current system if this system is geared towards exceeding the capacity of the planet? Is it ethical to perpetuate the cultural norms and ideals that have brought us to the brink of extinction and possible social and environmental collapse? And finally, can the cultural paradigm that created this situation also point us to a way out? Now, these are big questions. Each, I think, is a provocation piece in its own right, perhaps. They're tough questions. I think they require time and space to really digest and think through. They don't encourage quick answers, and nor should they. So really from here, what I don't want to do is dwell on answers, but what I do want to offer is 3 points, 3 starting points, or ways to consider them. And the 3 points I want to cover are, firstly, the alignment with the GTCS, the provocation series. Second is to look at young people's demands on education. And then finally, I want to go over some discussions I've had and really look at implications for professional practice. So the first point, to look at the provocation series. Now, what I want to do is just kind of situate the gist of Andreotti's questions and this provocation piece as a whole within the context of the other provocation pieces in this series. I think there is much common ground. In fact, to be worried if some of these complex issues of sustainability didn't align with the other issues that were raised in the provocation series. I think we should see overlap. We should see shared agendas. So I saw overlap with Rowena Arshad's presentation from March 22 and her discussions of culturally appropriate pedagogy. I think there's also overlap with Joe Smith, where he quite rightly raises the issue of learnification, as Biesta has proposed, and he does so within the context of history, which leads him at one point, I think, to question, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but to ask a question about can a young person understand the world we live in without understanding issues of colonisation and imperialism? And I think I'm asking the same here, or that we are asking the same here, because we're broadening this out to suggest that we need to understand these issues in order to explore the factors that underpin and exacerbate the injustices and the inequalities that are faced. So these factors of colonialism, imperialism, these are inextricably linked to broader complex sustainability issues. We need to understand the social and cultural context, these extractivist ways of thinking where we prioritise the life and well-being of one over another, be it a person, a community, nation, species or ecosystem. These ways that have led us into the climate and biodiversity emergencies that we're in. So I think we need to see these issues in the round, because it's about seeing the ways in which social justice, gender justice, food justice, spatial justices, where we live and who lives in those spaces. These are all the many ways in which sustainability issues are playing out in our everyday lives. And I also want to just tie in another point which Joe Smith raised, which has long been in these kind of keeping me awake at night stream of thoughts that I have. And he talked about, and I'm going to perhaps paraphrase him again here, so forgive me if I do, but he suggests that young people are questioning the production model of education, that it's simply about preparedness for employability and a labour market. And again, I'd agree with all of that. And I'd suggest too that this, in effect, is a questioning of capitalism and the systems and the structures that got us into the lifestyles that we have today, sort of the dominant lifestyles that are characterised by consumption and greed and consumerism. Many of the things that have led us into these complex, interconnected sustainability challenges that we face. And a recent article that came out from Friends of the Earth Australia really captured these dominant narratives that were pushing this lifestyle. And this is what they wrote here. They're talking about dominant Western narratives, which are now becoming global narratives that are telling us we deserve to have everything, even if it comes at the cost of someone or something else. And this is aimed at anyone who can pay for it. This narrative drives consumption, and it will perpetuate extractivism for as long as it remains the dominant story. The expectation of luxury and convenience leads us to strive for individually owned laptops and phones, cars, dishwashers, coffee machines, hot water systems, sound systems, TVs, etc. Because we want it here and we want it now, and we're taught our lives are more important than others. From here, I'd like to move straight into the next point, as I feel this now turns to look at some of these issues, but in relation to young people's demands on education. Now, I cannot speak for all young people, nor would I dare to, but I can share some insights gained through a series of workshops that we, colleagues and I, held in 2021, which held space for some frank, youth-led community conversations where young people were asking some important questions about the education they felt that they deserved. One of these conversations reflected on how young people felt that they weren't really educated about the socio-political or the economic dimensions of sustainability. And they talked about the avoidance of these conversations, the lack of connection being made between sustainability and political, social and economic issues, all of which they felt reinforced feelings that they had of powerlessness. And I should acknowledge at this point that perhaps these conversations are happening, but perhaps it's not for all learners. It might just be for those who put themselves forward or are chosen by staff or other pupils to be part of eco clubs or another kind of select group of learners and eco committees perhaps. I don't feel that these are necessarily universal for all learners. And so I think the point still remains, as it was raised in these discussions, that these young people felt that because of this disjuncture between the evident scale of the problem, what young people could see on social media, what they could feel in the world around them, in the world in which, the living world they are part of. And then the kinds of individualised solutions being discussed within the classroom, things such as perhaps reducing plastic use or carbon footprinting exercises, all of these things being admirable activities in their own right, but perhaps they are not getting to the deep education that is needed to adequately critique our systems and examine our ways of thinking and acting. So let me just share a snippet from the discussion. And they said here, the education system is built to benefit those in power and keep the world as it is. It's not built to help the world adapt. It's about teaching us how to live in the world as it is, which is the capitalistic world based on colonialism. And these young people also discussed feelings that schooling was an instrument of socialisation. They talked about their experiences leaving them feeling that schooling was ultimately about reproducing capitalist workforce, which here, again, I felt resonates with a lot of the points raised in Joe Smith's provocation piece as well. They also discussed colonial nostalgia within the school system. They discussed the need to decolonise the curriculum. And in this case, they were talking through the fact that they'd never experienced any critical discussions of racialised capitalism in school, which similarly, I feel, links to the points raised by Rowena and the need for inclusive and culturally appropriate pedagogy that adequately reflects the contemporary world that young people encounter and we all live within. So from here, I want to turn and think about the third point. I want to still keep with these discussions, that discussion series that I referred to, but what I want to move to now is to share the educator's perspective on how they felt about these young people's demands on education. So I want to think about the discussions that I had with the educators, the teachers who were there, about the weight of these sustainability issues, provoking them to go through a form of ideological analysis to consider their role as being perhaps complicit in upholding those cultural practices, those norms that perpetuate those paradigms that might continue to hold us in particular places, as Andreotti's questions were framing it. So really what we were trying to do was get to this process of trying to question the practices and norms within which we might exist. So this isn't a light or easy task necessarily. I know it can be confronting, it can be troubling, it can be difficult, because what it's inviting us to do is to step outside of the boxes and the places that we sit within and really question the structures that hold us in those particular systems as well. And there's a lot been written about this. For example, Norgaard 2011 talks about humanity's denial of troubling knowledge. This is our sort of collective failure to acknowledge and respond to the big issues of our time. That it's human nature's tendency to disavow that troubling knowledge, to see it and to hold it, but to carry on, business as usual. So we know that this disavowal, the knowing but the not acting, is one of the key social processes that prevents society from taking responsibility or for doing something. And if you think of that in terms of education, then education can be seen as this sort of the abstract acquisition of propositional knowledge, that is like ideas and theories and so on, and that it's only effective, or if we see education as being like that, then it can only be effective up to the point where it begins to rub up against people's the structural constraints that impinge on our lives. So it's at that point that we get into these messy contradictions about what we know, and then the dominant values that shape our experiences of that living world as well. So to bring all of that into context and into the conversations that I was having, I remember a particularly interesting conversation with one teacher in particular that really got under the skin of why he felt uncomfortable. And this is just one example, but he talked about that rubbing up of his propositional knowledge, what he knew, and then this experiential knowledge, what he lived. And he talked about the tensions that he felt in terms of the mining village in which he lived. He talked about how he was effectively invested in the status quo. It supported the livelihoods of his friends and family, and so he knew all the facts around fossil fuel extraction, but he felt this conflict with his values as well. And he shared his experiences with me. He was saying things like, obviously it sort of like ended, and that had a massive impact. And if you look at the suicide rates and the drug abuse rates, I think everyone who's involved in this industry realised that it had to go, but it's the steps towards it. So here he was talking about how he knew coal extraction was wrong, but to quote him, he was saying, what else could we do? So these are complex issues. They're deeply rooted in our local places. They're deeply rooted in our cultures, our heritage, our families, our livelihoods. In terms of education, he was concerned about discussions about fossil fuel extraction, about coal mining. What would that do within the classroom? He could see how this might bring pupils into personal conflict, and he felt uncomfortable, unqualified perhaps, to stray away from a prescribed curriculum into areas that he felt would get controversial and that could provoke emotional responses that may lead into questioning of, the status quo of current social structures and paradigms. And he was worried about going beyond scientific fact and getting into things that felt more political, more ethical, more emotional dimensions. And that's just an example. And I've had similar conversations. I can relate to a few more that were perhaps, they were on the northeast coast of Scotland with teachers whose pupils had parents in the oil industries. That's a huge employer in the northeast of Scotland. And in that case, they were concerned about those students whose parents were working in the oil industry, and they could foresee questions and issues about right and wrongdoing, the implications that would go from children's to parents, and troubling conversations that might follow from this. And when I reflect on these conversations, I believe what they are highlighting is that we need to engage with these conversations. We need to find ways to engage with people's effective investment in the status quo, and why these conversations, or it also reinforces why these conversations need to be extended beyond the classroom and into the wider community, because schools, and so too our education systems, do not sit in isolation. So let's return back to Andreotti's questions then. To my mind, when I come back to these questions now, having gone through those starting points, what they say to me is that they need to be understood in the fullness of the places in which we live, the lives of the young people we work with, the communities in which they and the school and we all exist. I think we mustn't sidestep these issues either, or enter into sterile discussions for fear of troubling and uncomfortable situations. I think at that point, then we do risk entering into learning for unsustainability, because I think there we're in danger of uncritically perpetuating dominant discourses within our societies, rather than pausing to question, to interrogate, and to potentially disrupt them. Arjen Valls, that's the name I mentioned back at the outset. He talked about a radical response to learning for unsustainability, which he calls transgressive learning. He started to talk about this a while back, but in 2021 he wrote a particular piece about this. And he sees transgressive learning as an opportunity to open up these spaces for alternatives that are healthier, more just, more equitable, and perhaps indeed a bit more sustainable as well. And he feels that in order to do that, to open up these spaces, then what we have to do is go beyond often sort of the well-intentioned sustainability competencies and qualities, such as dealing with complexity and ambiguity, anticipating and imagining alternative futures, taking mindful action, having empathy and agency. Go beyond that to really start to dismantle the maladaptive, destructive structures, as he calls it, and the routines and associated values and principles, to get to a point where educators have, and I'll quote here from him, I'll read from his work, to get to the point where we've got the capacity to disrupt, to make the normal problematic and the ordinary less ordinary, to provoke and question, to take risks for the common good, to complicate matters rather than to simplify them, to become uncomfortable together by asking moral questions and posing ethical dilemmas, and to learn from the pushback and the resistance from the normalised, unsustainable systems all the above creates. These forms of transgressive learning, disruptive questioning, that invites all of us into the kinds of conversations that are going to challenge the status quo. And as Val suggests, they're going to unearth, they're going to uproot the mechanisms of exploitation, of oppression, of extractivism, of colonisation, of marginalisation, which might lead to tensions, conflicts and controversy, but it's there It's there where the critical consciousness lies, and spaces for fundamental change can arise as well. To my mind, nothing changes if nothing changes. To finish up, I want to come back to the title of this talk, Learning for Unsustainability. When I wrote it, I added a question, and I did this deliberately as I do think this is a question, and with questions we have choices in how we respond. Back in 2012, a working party brought together by the Scottish Government produced the One Planet Schools report, which in essence brought forth the recommendations that went on to form the Learning for Sustainability policy that we see within Scottish education today. And at that time, almost a decade ago, they asked for a renewed focus on teacher education and professional learning to support the development of learning for sustainability. But we're a decade down the line now, a decade. We still have the architecture and space within Curriculum for Excellence and within the Learning for Sustainability policy context to do this work, but I don't think we can expect education alone to be the silver bullet that addresses geopolitical complexities and structural inequalities. However, there is a pivotal role here for education and educators, teachers, to take a critical stance and really question the taken for granted practices of the time, to create ruptures, spaces, tears in the fabric to allow for educational experiences and meaningful learning that responds to everyday living world issues and leads to transformation and change for learners and all of us in times of huge uncertainty. Educational experiences that really call us to question, to resist, and to challenge these issues of unsustainability. Bell Hooks wrote, "The classroom remains the most radical space in the academy," and our words ring true here. Her call to action is to urge everyone to open our minds and our hearts so that we can know beyond the boundaries of what's acceptable, so that we can think and rethink, so that we can create new visions. I'm not going to top Bell Hooks. I wouldn't try to. So I want to leave you with her call to engage and act. But one final thing I will say is I began with the words saying that everything that I've shared, that might be spoken by me, but it's influenced by many beings. And I talked at the start about the coastline and the tide that lies close to my home on the East Coast. Now, our relationship with the natural world is core and fundamental to our collective future. And I hope that feeling has come across in all that I've said. It's something I hold deeply in my core. I do believe we are caught in this tension between planetary emergencies that we face, which are requiring us to act fast, but the paradigmatic shifts that we need to undergo to really do this at a deep level actually require us to pause, to consider, to assess our ways of thinking and being and doing. But I don't think we can dwell in that state for too long because we need to act. There is much work that we can do. So on that final note and call to action, I'll just stop there and I'll close by saying thank you for this opportunity to share my thinking with you all, and thank you for listening.